Good evening or good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to launch this online open studio. Welcome, everybody. Bienvenidos a todos. I'm going to introduce myself now. My name is Laura Osorio-Sannex, and I'm the head of the Santo Domingo Centre of Excellence for Latin American Research here at the British Museum. And I'm with Miriam Rudolph, who will be presenting herself at greater length in a minute. And just to give you a very brief introduction to the centre and to the project generally, as some of you will know, this is the first in a series of 3 online open studios that will be happening over the next 3 weeks, today, next Thursday, and then the following Wednesday, with 3 different groups of artists. So of course you're all welcome to come to those open studios too. The Santo Domingo Centre at the British Museum was launched as a collections research project effectively to try to better document and better understand the Latin American collections here. And what we have tried to do, myself and the other curators in the centre, is to not only carry out that research, but to really rethink some of the ways that collections research happens typically in anthropology museums and history museums. And so that means broadening the kinds of voices involved in research, and really looking to makers, to artists, to grassroots initiatives, to activists, to writers outside of the fields of anthropology and museums to really create a dialogue about the ongoing relevance of museums or otherwise, and how collections can be mobilized. Most importantly, one of the things that we do is try to create projects and support projects, platform projects that are more relevant in Latin America, that speak to contemporary realities and politics in Latin America, rather than just focusing solely on the materiality of the collections and the collection histories themselves. So this particular project, and it's been a privilege for me to work with the collaborators on the project, was developed with Miriam Rudolph here, with a collective of artists from the Chaco, who are part of a collective called Artes Vivos, who will be presenting next week. That's Osvaldo Pitue, Jorge Carema, Efacio Alvarez, Marcos Ortiz, Esteban Clasen, and Clemente Julios, who work with Verena Reher and Ursula Reher, who are both anthropologists and have worked with those anthropologists for a very long time, and with Lantoy Unro from the Enklet people, and Hannes Kalish. So they will be presenting in the final week, and there'll be more space for me to discuss their contributions to the project at that point. But just to say that the project was actually begun at the beginning of 2020. I knew that there were collections at the British Museum that were made by Wilfrid Barbara Grubb, an Anglican missionary, and Seymour Hawtrey, quite extensive collections, and that hadn't been very well researched in the past, or hadn't been researched in the past. And so I went to Paraguay on fieldwork, and specifically went to the Museo del Barro, which I think many of you will know. It's a museum that has really championed the inclusion of popular indigenous ceremonial arts as a form of erudite international contemporary art. And it's at that museum that I was introduced to the work of both the collective Artes Vivos and to Miriam. And I was immediately sort of impressed by this work, in part because of the way that I felt that they expressed the territory of the Chaco, which is something that I thought was an important perspective to take into account in terms of the dispossession of indigenous territories in the processes of creating these missionary collections. So you'll see Miriam and the collective's work as we go on, but really I think what I wanted to do was to sort of try to create these multiple layers of positionality. So look at different voices, the collective, Miriam, Lantoy, and create a sense of an expression of this territory that was both critical of the British Museum's collections, but also perhaps made a move towards making them relevant. So their artwork is very political. It speaks to diverse ontologies, which I think is something which is of increasing interest, both in specialized disciplines, but also in how we continue to understand cultural collections. And fundamentally, I think demonstrate a lot of sensibility for the Chaco and the people who live there. So I will not go on too long, but just to say that unfortunately, because of the pandemic, the project as it had been designed, which was to, of course, invite people to London to have an exchange, to create field work, to travel around, etc., became impossible. And so this has been a project that's been developed over the last 2 years, transnationally between Canada, between Paraguay, Switzerland, and the UK, but digitally. And I hope that this is something that we can discuss perhaps during the question and answers, because it's been incredibly intellectually challenging, but also quite inspiring to create this work over such a long period of time and in that way. The work that you'll see, I think, also speaks to that process. So I'm going to not talk anymore, but to give the floor now to Miriam, just to roadmap a little bit the Open Studio. Miriam is going to give a recorded presentation of her work, and then we're going to, and that's going to be about half an hour, and then we're going to open up the floor to questions and answers, and there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions as well. So thank you very much, and I hope you look forward to the video. Turning off.
Hello everyone, and welcome to my Open Studio. I'm Miriam Rudolph, and I'm a printmaker based in Winnipeg, Canada. I was born and raised in Paraguay, in a small Mennonite town in the Chaco. In 2003, I moved to Winnipeg to study fine arts at the University of Manitoba. Here, I was introduced to printmaking, and I fell in love with the medium. I was fascinated with the technical skills required to make a print, because of the variety of processes involved, starting with the preparation and etching of the plates, with countless ways to create marks on the copper surface, followed by mixing inks, inking and wiping the plates, the handling of specialty papers, and ultimately the printing itself, which is magic every time. Printmaking has often been used as a medium for the expression of political ideas, and I'm following in that tradition. I completed a master's in printmaking in 2017 at the University of Alberta. I'm now settled in Winnipeg with a house, a home studio, a large vegetable garden, my husband, and our sweet little Max. I acknowledge that I grew up on the territory of the Inklit in the Paraguayan Chaco, and that I currently live on Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. I loved growing up in Paraguay, and I had a happy and carefree childhood. I'm well aware that I had a privileged life. My dad was German, a language arts teacher at the local Mennonite high school in a small rural town. He traveled a lot with us through parts of South America and Germany. Having also studied history, he loved museums, and every trip and summer holiday included several museum visits in pretty much every city we went to. Today, of course, there is much debate about the provenance of collections and the circumstances of their acquisitions, providing ample opportunity to engage with our colonial histories and perhaps giving us a chance for dialogue and reparations as our understanding and thinking changes. I was thrilled when I was approached by Laura from the British Museum to ask if I was interested in doing an artist residency to create an artistic response to their Paraguay collection. The collection consists of Indigenous artifacts collected by British Anglican missionaries Seymour Hawtrey and Wilfrid Barbrook Grubb at the turn of the 20th century. Since I wasn't able to go to London and access the objects in storage in person due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the London team photographed and uploaded the images of all the artifacts. There were tools, ornaments, and ritual objects. I struggled to connect with the artifacts that appeared on my computer screen. They belong to a different culture and time that I have little personal knowledge of. Nonetheless, I was very curious about their story and their current existence in storage. This project gave me the opportunity to research the early colonization history of the Lower Chaco from the Anglican perspective and to further explore the colonial history of my own roots, the settlement of the Mennonites in the central Chaco beginning in 1927, which resulted in the displacement of the Entangled Norte. For me, these artifacts are the starting point to question history. What does the collector, Wilfrid Barbrook Grubb, tell us about the objects and his time in Paraguay? What do indigenous voices have to say about their past and present? What do my own people, Mennonite settlers, tell about their arrival and settlement in the Chaco? Whose experience, whose history is being told, preserved, taught, and perpetuated? While the histories of interaction between the Anglican missionaries and the Entangled Sur on the one hand, and between Mennonite settlers and the Entangled Norte on the other hand are not the same, I felt the general colonization processes were so similar that they lent themselves well to juxtapose the different perspectives on the history of the region. I decided to include text in my work and create an artist's book because I spent so much time reading during the early stages of the project, and the different perspectives of the narratives were just so jarring. I was struck by the outdated language and use of certain words from the early texts. As shocking and problematic as some of those texts are, I find hope in the fact that we think differently today, that we are moving forward with our understanding of a multicultural coexistence and of the necessity to decolonize our thinking. I found many texts profoundly moving because they changed my own understanding of my history and helped me make sense of things I have sensed before but didn't have the words to express. For each theme that delves into the processes of colonization, I chose roughly 3 text excerpts to accompany each print, with first-person accounts by indigenous elders, recorded and published only within the last 30 years, texts by Mennonite settlers and scholars who have kept a record of the Mennonite experience spanning the past century, and the experiences of Anglican missionaries from about 100 years ago. The text excerpts are printed in color to form a visual thread throughout the reading that connects them visually and conceptually with the images. Please let me present the result of this artist's residency. A museum case. A collection of prints and texts. Layered Histories, Perspectives on Colonization from the Chaco, is an artist's book that explores the complexities of colonization of the Paraguayan Chaco region. For the past year, I've printed a series of 12 prints, accompanied by text pages that explore the diverging narratives of experiences and history. The prints and text excerpts trace the events of early contacts between European missionary explorers and settlers through the change in landscape and ways of living of the indigenous people, to today's attempts at indigenous assertion of their rights and tentative perspectives for the future. Remembering. With the first print, I want to acknowledge the starting point for the project, the Paraguay collection at the British Museum. Looking through the uploaded photos of the collection, I noticed a system of boxes, physical storage boxes stacked on shelves, digital folders labeled Box 1, Box 2, Box 24, numbered, labeled, categorized, organized. The square format references the acts of organizing and closing, boxing in and boxing up, collecting and storing the collection, also embodied in the museum case that houses this artist's book, as well as the colonial imposition of a certain kind of order, of will, of a way of life, and of a way of thinking. The print plays with the idea of the boxes and the ordered grid, contrasted by the densely growing forest that provided everything the Entangled Sur needed to live. The great cloud and drips evoke a kind of loss, a loss of culture, and a fading of memories of the importance and the meaning of the artifacts with time. Out of all the hundreds of artifacts in the collection, I was drawn to the long necklaces made of little discs cut from shells and pierced with a hole to be threaded onto strings. They were used as currency. The longer the necklace, the more worth it had. I find the idea of creating your own currency based on Skill, time, patience, need, and want. Interesting. The second object I chose to print was a pipe head. In a later text excerpt, one of the Intlet elders talks about how a Mennonite missionary threw their pipe in the fire to weaken the power and influence of the elders and shamans. The pipe represents a cultural power that was taken away. Terra Nullius. My maternal grandparents migrated to the Paraguayan Chaco in 1927 from Manitoba, Canada. Growing up, the general Mennonite history narrative was always, and continues to be, something like this. There was nothing here but wilderness. We arrived in a green hell. The Indians welcomed us and helped us with the farming. We made something of this land. God sent us here to evangelize the Indians. They came to us because they were starving, and we helped them. We coexist peacefully to this day. This narrative follows a typical settler mythology pattern based on the concept of terra nullius, meaning nobody's land, empty land that is vacant, uncultivated, unproductive, somehow lacking and incomplete, as Roger Epp puts it. The concept of terra nullius does not acknowledge the right of indigenous people to exist in a land that form an integral part of it, and gives the settlers a sacrament of innocence. The digitally printed background of the print is an early sketch map by Anglican missionary Seymour Hawtrey from 1900, who literally put the Chaco region on the map. Maps are used for laying claim, for surveying the land, for parceling, selling, privatizing land, for claiming ownership. The dense forest is both beautiful and a terrifying wilderness, depending on the view of the beholder, providing life-giving space to some and representing something that needs taming and ordering for the other. The arrival of the missionary explorers, backed and supported by politicians and ranchers, figures printed on the backside of the translucent paper, pushes the wilderness back. Neocolonial landscape portrays the change in landscape after the settlement of the region. Simeon Negro, former leader of the Intlet community Campo Largo, says, "The Intlet had many places in the Chaco. A large circle describes that land of the Intlet. Today we live within a very small circle in Campo Largo. Nevertheless, we maintained the memory of the places of our ancestors because it is very important that the young be able to compare both circles, so that we don't think it is impossible to have more space than we do today." In my print, a large circle of forest shines through from the backside of the paper, while only a small section of forest remains in the landscape of fields and pastures. Kelvin Redekop, Mennonite sociologist, writes, "A plane ride over the Chaco impresses the observer with the vastness of the area and the degree to which it is forested and undisturbed. But suddenly the sweep of the eye over the flat topography is broken by a man-made ordering of the environment. Abruptly, the forest gives way to cleanly cleared fields, geometrically laid pastures and roads, orchards, farmyards, villages, and towns." Throughout the prints, I continued to play with the square format with the inclusion of digitally printed early maps, contemporary satellite imagery, and the grid, which pertain to land surveying, mapping, and fencing in imposed order from outside. Roads. One of the first steps in the colonization process of the Chaco after loosely mapping the region was the establishment of roads. The Anglican missionaries prided themselves for creating inroads and making the Chaco more accessible to European ranchers and settlers. Metyayam, member of the Intlet people, recounts, "After the Mennonites came, they began to choose campos. They went in different directions to choose campos and made roads through the fields of the Intlet. The Intlet, however, didn't want to give up their fields. They wanted to keep their sweet potatoes. The Mennonites set up posts, which the Intlet didn't like at all. 'No, not here,' they said. but there was nothing to be done. The Entangled didn't want to give up their fields. While the sweet potatoes were growing, the Mennonites built their roads through the fields of the Entangled, built their villages on their fields. The Entangled didn't want to give up their fields, but the Mennonites didn't listen to them. Eventually, the Entangled gave up. The account by Metyayam has hit me hard. Time and time again, we were told the indigenous people were so incredibly poor and starving when the Mennonites arrived. Yet Metyayam clearly shares that they had seasonal gardens that provided food, which the Mennonite settlers destroyed. The hunger came after the settlement. Fences are a symbol of privatization of land, a point of pride for landowners, and a necessity for cattle ranchers to keep their property safe and contained. Fences frequently appear in indigenous accounts as an obstacle that cuts off traditional pathways and hunting grounds, that limits movement and keeps their traditional lands inaccessible. Entangled elder Mang Vayam Ai describes the following scene. We lived on the other side of the fence until we were approached by Chaco, a Mennonite from Nempena Amyep. Do you want to hear the word of God? From then on, we lived in Chaco Piayem's yard. No longer did we stay on the other side of the fence. In most indigenous accounts, the fences kept them out. Here, they are invited in. Mang Vayam Ai and his people are invited to join the newcomers, but they are expected to change. Crossing the fence symbolizes a point of no return, of leaving the traditional way of life on the other side. I really struggled with the image for the print Encounters, and it only came together at the end of the project. I felt a discomfort trying to figure out how to portray encounters between the settler population and indigenous people. From the text excerpts, I also get a sense of discomfort, where the indigenous narrator feels excluded, misunderstood, and judged by the settlers, and the settler voice expresses fear and trepidation towards the other. I think to this day there is much discomfort and unease in encounters due to overt racism, unequal power dynamics, prejudice, and inequalities on every social and economic level. The print is divided in half by the repeated grid pattern to evoke the separation between the settler and indigenous communities. The figures representing the settler men and women are large and strongly drawn and etched. The size and strength of these figures alludes to their position of power. They fill half the page and spread out freely within the space, while the more delicately etched indigenous figures are confined to a much smaller and clearly outlined square. Herein lies an irony. The settlers fear the indigenous people, while they themselves are the ones taking over the other's land and a way of life. The missionary is the go-between figure. While most settlers don't interact much with indigenous people, at least not beyond an employer-employee relationship, the missionary has direct contact to communities. However, he generally represents the interests of the settler community that backs him. From my own experience, I always felt a deep chasm between communities, a clear us and them. To this day, there is a separation between white settlers and indigenous communities. We don't share schools, churches, or hospitals. We live in separate towns and settlements or reserves. The gap between rich and poor is staggering. Indigenous people are generally laborers working for Mennonite employers and have little or no political representation. Most decisions regarding life in the Chaco are made by the settler communities and governments, and decisions regarding indigenous people are made in a top-down, paternalistic way. Dispossession. Ownership of land is a European capitalist concept completely foreign to the indigenous people of the Chaco who lived in a sharing economy. Again, the grid reflects the surveying, parceling, and privatization of the land. The dripping vegetation evokes a sadness and a loss. The blank figures of indigenous people appear to have their presence erased in a way, but they also convey strength in their stances. The leading female figure on the right, overlapped with the bottle tree, references a stronger female presence in the social structure of the community, but she almost disappears. Dispossession does not only refer to being dispossessed of land, but also of culture. Mission. Missionaries appear on the frontiers of colonization. The Paraguayan government welcomed the presence of Wilfrid Barbrook Grubb and gave him the title of Pacificator of the Indians in 1892. Missionaries were seen as benign figures that would befriend and pacify indigenous communities, to introduce European thought, religion, and way of life, to prepare the way for future settlers and the development of the land. The background of the print mission is a map of Maclawaya by Walter Reguer from 1979, the Anglican mission station founded by Barbrook Grubb. To the left is an outline of the mission buildings. To the right, on the other side of the road, are two neat rows of cottages for the indigenous inhabitants surrounded by farmland. I picked up on the rows of houses and printed several models of cottages in 2 rows in my print. The indigenous figures are confined within one small square. The preaching missionary is lecturing in the bottom left corner, backed by the interests of a politician and a settler. There is a physical space between the missionary and the group that alludes to the distance between them. The print exploitation depicts a large cattle herd pressing forward that dominates the image. Cattle ranching has taken over large parts of the Chaco and contributes to the displacement of indigenous communities. Also, indigenous laborers are frequently employed in the cattle ranching industry. They build the fences, they tend to the cattle, they work on maintaining the pastures by clearing bush and brush. They also predominantly work in the meat processing plants, and as far as I know, most of this is done for minimum wage. While there are labor laws in place now, when the settlers first arrived, much of the work for the Mennonites was done in exchange for food or clothes. The settler community prides itself very much for their work ethic and all they have achieved in building a lucrative export industry of beef and dairy that has brought them a high living standard. However, the success and wealth has been achieved through the exploitation of cheap indigenous labor throughout the past 95 years. Wilfrid Barbrook Grubb writes in 1910, "The Indian, for the next generation or so, must be content to earn his living by manual labor. While we impress upon him that we regard him as a fellow man and brother, we at the same time leave him under no misapprehension as to his place in the world being a humble one until such a time as, in the course of evolution, he is qualified for a higher plane." Loss. The losses indigenous people in the Chaco have experienced throughout the colonization process are unimaginable to me. A loss of land and territory, a loss of home, a loss of culture, a loss of a way of life, a loss of a sense of identity, a loss of autonomy, of freedom, a sense of power, a loss of an understanding of the world. This was a difficult piece to do. I am keenly aware that I am attempting to express someone else's experience, and the portrayal of a kind of victimhood can be problematic, but I believe that feeling empathy for others' losses is an important process towards understanding. To me, acknowledging the losses and wrongdoing is an essential step towards any kind of reconciliation and healing process. Hans Wiens writes that Mennonite missionary Dietrich Lepp, a young zealous worker, wanted to eradicate shamanism and sorcery. He forbade the medicine men to work at the mission stations. As soon as he heard their singing, be it day or night, he went there and told them to stop. In Disruptions, a large group of indigenous figures is marching and blocking a road. The repeated layering of the figures darkens the tone and helps to give them a stronger presence. Now the positions are reversed from previous prints. The indigenous figures take center stage and fill out a large portion of the image. The figures of politicians and settlers are pushed to the corner and forced to watch and act. This print is based on a protest in 2015 by members of the Entangled Sur and Sanapanak community of Sakmok-Kasek, which ultimately resulted in the restitution of a portion of the ancestral lands with the backing of a ruling by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. To me, this protest symbolizes a direction of thinking that interrupts colonial patterns. It shows that different ways of thinking, acting, and being are indeed possible. I wanted to end my book on a somewhat hopeful note, with a view to a future that might be more just and equitable for everyone. The title, Remembering, carries multiple meanings. The importance to remember the past through subaltern voices, and to bring people in from the margins, allowing them to again become members of society in their land. The figures in this print come together as a community. Settler women stand next to Indigenous women. Settler children stand next to Indigenous children. A politician stands next to an Indigenous man. I re-etched all the figures representing the settler society for this print, to scale them down to the same size as the figures representing Indigenous people. With the change in scale, I wanted to portray the importance of an equal society, where people see and treat each other as equals, where political decisions are community-based and not top-down. One of the most interesting texts that I feel rounds off the book really beautifully is the text by former Anglican missionary Stephen Kidd. He came to Maklawaya, the Anglican mission station Wilfrid Barbrook Grubb founded, 95 years after Grubb. Kidd writes, "As my Christian faith withered away, I gradually developed a different perspective on Tl't culture and social life, and my personal mission changed from one of transformation to a desire to share in the life of the Tl't. Rather than seeking to eradicate Tl't social practices, I became increasingly committed to trying to understand and experience them." We often think of colonization as a process of history in the past, but the impacts of colonization continue to pervade everything in our lives today. Social structures and systems, our perception of land and property, the content we are taught in schools, the way we think about, interact with, and treat others on whose land we now live, whose artifacts we store, work for us, and whose experiences are not taught in schools. While this project looks at a very specific art collection and a very specific region in Paraguay, there are similarities with colonial history and colonial thinking the world over. This artist's book invites to question our biases, our perceptions, and our understanding of history, and challenges us to decolonize our thinking.
Thanks very much for that. Thanks, Miriam. So we still have 15 minutes, and so if anyone has any questions, do go ahead and put it into the chat or the Q&A, whichever section you'd like. I'm going to start off actually, if everyone doesn't mind, with one question for Miriam, and that is about the relationship between form and content in your artwork. It's something that I found interesting before we talked, when I saw your artwork at the Museo del Barro, and it's this idea that the print medium has allowed all of these different layers to create a sense of multiple perspectives. And especially when you superimpose on top of fences and maps, and so the position of the viewer is destabilized somehow, and somehow I feel that is interesting, both in its relationship to indigenous art forms, such as the artes vivos, the way that they present dimensionality, but also just in terms of this idea of there being multiple perspectives and sort of ways of living on the territory of the Chaco. And so basically my question is, how does your medium print, the form effectively, intersect with the content of what you're trying to say?
Right. Yeah, thanks for that question, and thanks for those observations too. Yeah, I mean, printmaking quintessentially lends itself to reproduction. So you either reproduce the same image over and over, or in my case, I use various plates that I reproduce on top of each other, sometimes repeating the same image over and over to create these multiple layers. And I mean, part of all these layers is quintessentially also part of what my project is about, to portray all these different layers and different perspectives and perceptions and overlap them with each other to create a narrative. And it's also reflected in the title of the book, of Layered Histories. So I think, as you could maybe see a little bit in my work process, is I etch a lot of different plates with image elements, which I call my plate library. So I can just draw from my plate library to see which image elements I need for my images to build them up. And in a way, focusing on these individual image elements helps me break down the complexities of history and of the narrative for myself first, before then kind of putting them back together. And yeah, to kind of make sense of the complexities of it all. And in some ways, these layers also allow me to use factual knowledge, like the maps, for example, or the satellite imagery, but it also gives me space for interpretation of how I personally see history, or how I perceive the different perspectives of history. And it also allows me to include emotion through the mark making, say, of the clouds. Like I put emotion into the narrative as well. Yeah, so does that answer your question? I mean, and there are many instances where I use form and content to convey the meaning, like the square format and the boxes and the grids and all that is also part of the form and content. Or printing on both sides of the paper gives an added layer of meaning to the image elements that are then on the reverse of the paper. So in the print of neocolonial landscapes, for example, the large forest that used to be the territory of the Enclit is now, there is that physical barrier of the paper that that separates it from the present, so to speak. So
interesting, thank you. So well, I have another question actually. No one has asked a question yet, so I'll plow ahead with my other question, which is about the very first print, Remembering. And obviously that's an image that resonates with me for good reason, because I spend lots of time looking at those boxes, but also because of the object that you chose to depict. So I don't know if this has come across to those of you in the audience, but Miriam, actually, her work really doesn't engage all that much with the indigenous material in the collection, and that was a choice that you made, wasn't it, Miriam, to sort of leave that part of the project to our indigenous collaborators and participants and artists. But that very first print is you do actually have a print of the necklace of shell beads that you describe, that was used as a kind of a currency, effectively, in the Chaco historically. And there are these small kind of beads or buttons that have been carved from shell that's from the region, right, from the river edge. And so they don't strictly have, the material itself doesn't carry the value. The value is in the time it takes to carve these tiny things, and the knowledge to do so. And that's something that interests me. I think that's very much in a sense, one of the bents of museum collections and museum sensibilities, which is this idea of seeing value in multiple ways, cross-culturally. So my question is, for you, that could be seen as a metaphor, couldn't it? This idea of a value in something because of because of it having been made by someone, rather than the raw materials. And so how would you describe the word value in the context of your own artwork?
Right. Oh, that's a really interesting observation. I did not consciously make that connection between the creation of the beads as currency and my own creative art making, as creating my own objects of value for trade, so to speak. But maybe that's why I was drawn to the necklaces, because on some level I connect to that kind of creative making and trading. Well, for me, the starting point for any creative work is always a very personal connection with the content that I want to convey. Yeah, the desire to process something through visual language. And I must admit, I make a living as an artist, but I always really struggle assigning monetary value to my work, because you can't just say, oh, I worked so and so many hours and my hourly wage is so and so much. It just doesn't work that way with the creative processes. I must admit, I approach galleries quite often, and we figure out a price together for pieces that go into a gallery for sale. And it's usually based on with the prints that I make on edition size and on the size of the piece, and then somewhat to the with the complexity of the piece itself too. And living in a capitalist society, I also have to figure out how much what is feasible for me, like which prices are still saleable and I can still make a living of it with the cuts that the galleries take. And so there are some practical aspects too in determining what works. But I have these two streams of work. I have I make work that I sell and that I make a living with, and then I make work that is a lot more that ends up going home with people that they put on their walls. And I find it somehow very satisfying knowing that my work shares the daily life, that the people share their lives with my work on a daily basis. And yeah, some of my work is much more research-based and heavy and maybe political, and it's not that saleable. So to me, those are more gallery or exhibition pieces. And I'm really grateful that there's government funding available for artists to create cultural output, so to speak. So I feel there isn't always monetary value to work, but also cultural value. Does that answer your question?
It does, absolutely. Of course it does. Yeah. We've got some questions now from the audience. I'm keen to press on with those. We have a question from Florencio Unru, who says, when you mention that the artwork is about emotions, which emotions are you talking about?
I think I feel a lot of sadness, and it was a lot of kind of heaviness to work through too. Like for me, it was sadness or a kind of regret of not having known a lot of things sooner, because of the way that I was taught history or a certain point of view. And only growing up, I often had a sense that something doesn't quite add up here, or why is it like this? And so I think I asked a lot of questions, but I didn't necessarily get answers until I was an adult, or even until I moved to Canada, because I mean, Canada has a fairly similar colonial history too to Paraguay, and there's a lot of discourse about colonial history happening here too. And so I became more and more aware of the underpinnings of how history is told. So yeah, I think regret is one of the emotions, and then just sadness of that immense loss of culture, and I think generational trauma of loss that that I sense. Like I mean, I haven't had that experience, of course, but I think I can feel a kind of empathy towards it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Once I understand it, or once I am aware of it.
Yeah. Okay, there are some other questions. Could you, this is from someone called Nick Reagan. Could you talk about the color palette? It's noticeably muted despite the luminescence of the Chaco.
I think I'm drawn to a muted color palette, especially with the more difficult subject matters. I feel if it was really brightly colored, it wouldn't quite convey maybe the seriousness of it. And I chose a consistent color palette throughout. And I must say, I don't know if I find the Chaco that colorful. Like the last 10 years that I lived there was 10 years of drought. So there was a lot of gray and dust, and yeah, the bush looked, the Chaco forest looked a bit drab at the time, but obviously there are seasonal changes. But to me, that forest always has kind of that grayish green color. And then I chose the blue, a muted blue-gray for indigenous people. And then the color red is that the thread of image elements that convey some kind of colonial image element of colonization.
Brilliant. And then I would love to engage and keep you talking about these things, but I want people to have their questions responded to. So which of your pieces is from Bruna Antelo Perez? Which of your pieces would you say is the most meaningful to you?
Oh, that's a tough one. I spent so much time with each one of them. I think there are two. The second piece, Terra Nullius, meant a lot to me because, again, it was a concept that I came across as an adult, and it just made so much sense in terms of the entire colonization history. And what I enjoyed while making the print was how both viewpoints of history are really prevalent in this print. Like you can read the excerpt by the Mennonite settlers that goes with it, and the print makes perfect sense. And you can read the text excerpt by the indigenous person, and the print makes perfect. Like you can see the print somehow from two different angles. But in terms of other content, I think the last one, which was the last piece that came together too, is where I actually had to go back to the studio to re-etch the plates, to scale down the figures and just bring it together. And think that, just that more hopeful look to the future, where I hope that people will start rethinking or questioning their thinking, and maybe rethinking what our future could look like. That meant a lot to me personally. Your sound is off, Laura.
Yeah, sorry. I know we're sort of coming to the end of this, unfortunately, but I think we can press on just for 2 more minutes. There are 2 questions. Maria Eugenia Dominguez asks you, are there any points in common between your art and the indigenous artists from the Chaco who make contemporary art? And if so, which are these points of commonality, and which would be the distinctions? And I know it's a very dense question, but in 2 minutes, and appreciate the fact that there's another question.
Yeah, I think what distinguishes our art is that the indigenous artists create work from a very, very personal point, and they portray their daily life and the lived experience of their history, whereas I think I give more of a maybe academic overview of of what has happened in the region. And then maybe on a creative level, I've loved the work by the indigenous artists for many years. I think I've been familiar with their work for probably 20 years. And I think something of the narrative style, and maybe also the flattening of space, which also pertains to your question earlier of perspective, I think has inspired some of the ways I work with imagery as well.
Absolutely. And then very, very quickly and finally, from Gabriela Zucolillo, very beautiful work, and would like to know who you imagine as your public.
Yeah, obviously I have an audience in mind. I think ideally I would like to show this work in Paraguay because obviously the history is there, and that's also where I would like to see a change of thinking happening on the ground. But it also scares me a little bit to show the work out there because I know it is critical of communities and societies out there. And I don't intend to offend anyone, but I know that some people will take offense from my work. So that makes me feel uncomfortable.
That is brilliant. And I'm so sorry that we've run out of time. But we have one quick final question from Elaine Cohn. The book is beautiful. And sorry, because this may have been mentioned, but was part of the research directly with the Chaco, indigenous Chaco communities now, or is it work that comes from the personal experience of growing up in the Mennonite community?
Most of my research comes from texts that have been published in the last 10, 20, yeah, in the last 10 years or so. I mean, obviously some of the work is informed by my own personal experience, but all the text material comes from fairly recent publications. And I would like to give a shout out to Hannes Kalisch, who has compiled most of the accounts by the Intlet Norte and published them and made them accessible to the public. And for me, reading his books, his commentaries, and the compilation of firsthand accounts were just life-changing.
Brilliant. And so brilliant. And then just one final question. I'm just like, it's like, yeah, I just keep going, even though I keep saying I'm going to stop. But again, from Florencio Unruh, and I think it's a really good question. And it follows on from what you were saying earlier about the muted tones versus bright colors, because he asks you if you know of any natural dyes, indigenous dyes from the region, and if so.
I'm aware of indigenous regional dyes, but it's not something that I've worked with, or I wouldn't be familiar. I wouldn't know how to extract them or how to utilize them. So that would be a completely separate research trip to Paraguay and find that out.
Science, I tried it, it's hard. Okay, and then thank you very much, Miriam, for answering those questions and for allowing me to plow through them so quickly. Thank you so much to everybody who's taken the time this evening to come and listen to Miriam exhibit her work for us. And I'd just like to say, please join us next Thursday at the same time with Artes Vivos, which is an indigenous artist collective from who will be presenting their work as part of the same project. And Miriam, would you like to say something?
Yes, I would like to bring your attention to the fact that that's Max coming in. My book is also available for download digitally through the SDCELAR website. So if you go through to the page of my artist statement further down at the bottom, there's a link. You can download a digital version in English and Spanish. So you can take the time to read the text excerpts and spend more time with the images as well. Thank you for having been here.